You're listening to Colorado Chamber Office Hours, a podcast that explores what matters most to business. I'm your host, Ed Sealover, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Colorado Chamber of Commerce and editor of the Sum and Substance. Let's get talking. All right, if you listened to last week's episode, which focused on a bill that sought to allow local governments to establish vacancy taxes on second homes that sat empty for significant portions of the year, you may know that bill died in committee by Monday night. And thus we acknowledge that episode had a limited shelf life. Well, today we are talking about a subject that will be a focus throughout this legislative session and even well beyond that: the rising costs of childcare and how state government can help to limit them. There are 4 bills that have been introduced in this session, and 2 of them are advancing already by overwhelming bipartisan margins. But the details in these bills, especially a key tax break proposal, are always in flux. And we're going to get into those details and the bigger picture issue of childcare today with Nicole Riehl, the president and CEO of the organization Executives Partnering to Invest in Children, better known as EPIC. Thank you, Nicole, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Ed. Excited to be here and glad to say that this will definitely have a longer shelf life than that other podcast you mentioned.
I think our producers are glad about that, too. All right, let's start the conversation, Nicole. I want to ask you a question that I asked you in an interview the first time we spoke many years ago, but it's a question I think others may still wonder about, and that is, why is childcare such an important issue for businesses to care about in Colorado?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it because not everyone is as close to this issue personally. Some people have not had children. Some people have children in the rearview mirror, and it is, a long past memory of theirs in terms of what that looked like. But it's a really important issue, and I will say it is growing every day in its importance to the business community, to our workforce, and to our communities at large. And it's really good timing because this week there was a new report that was just released by Ready Nation. They've been releasing a report every 4 years that really looks at the economic cost of the childcare gaps we have across the country and in each state. And in 2018, the economic cost was $57 billion. In 2022, it was $122 billion. And this year in 2026, it's $172 billion. Huge price tag, right? That's a B with a billion. And so when we think about what that means, it's about $7,000 being lost per parent due to job search or lost earnings potential. We've got about $2,000 per parent working for employers that are losing productivity, management burdens, et cetera. When we think about that for Colorado, it's about $3.3 billion and tens of thousands of sidelined workers and productivity we're not getting there. And so, if we want to boil that down to the number of workers in our Colorado economy, it's about $1,000 economic cost we're paying right now because of this childcare gap, right? It's kind of an invisible tax, if you will, and an economic drag on our economy. We want to be the best in Colorado. We want to be the best for business. We want to attract companies. We want to grow. We want to create jobs. And this is not a social issue. It's an economic drag on our economy, and it's impacting our ability to be competitive. So if we want Colorado's economy to grow, we cannot ignore a $3.3 billion anchor that is tied to our workforce and our businesses in our economy.
$3.3 billion in economic impact is like if the entire craft beer industry disappeared tomorrow. All the jobs, all the sales, all the impact that goes with it.
Right.
What are our numbers right now in terms of how short are we in the number of childcare slots versus what we need?
Well, I mean, there's some debate around, what that looks like, but I would say overall, easily, we are upwards of about 70,000 slots short here in Colorado when it comes to childcare. And most of those missing slots are for younger children, families that have infants and toddlers who they need in care in order to return to their jobs or stay or go into the workforce as they'd like to, right? We always want to make sure families can make the choices that are right for them, but a lot of families want to and or need to make sure they can enter the workforce. And that care for the younger ages in particular is really missing in most of our communities, in particular rural communities. But, you've heard the child care desert term before. Basically what that means is for, every one child care slot available, you have 3 or more families looking for care. But even in core areas like downtown Denver here, you have 10 families looking for every 2 slots available for those young children. It's a real issue.
And I think it goes without saying that the people who are affected the most here are females, typically are the typical caregivers in a family. But you just made mention to something that I think stands out too. Are there particular areas or industries that are affected? It sounds like particularly in rural areas, this could be dragging the economy down.
It's huge for our rural areas. We hear from lots of employers and partners in rural, frontier, resort regions of our state that in order for their businesses to stay open, in order for their towns to remain vibrant and strong, they need that workforce there. And that workforce needs childcare. It is absolutely critical. And so we are seeing many of our rural communities start to address this directly through some local revenue measures because they recognize that their local towns, their local communities will not continue to remain vibrant and strong unless they address this childcare challenge.
And speaking of addressing this, I know you've been working on this for a number of years. What has the state, working with organizations like yours, been able to do so far over the past, say, 4 or 5 years to address this?
We've made some good progress. Governor Polis certainly has been a governor that has been very strong and has led on education and investing in children and families and affordability. So investing in things like full-day kindergarten, investing in universal preschool here in Colorado has made a big difference for a lot of families. You've heard him talk about putting $6,000 a year back into the pockets of families. That directly addresses affordability. It addresses tax base and economic stimulus locally. And of course, it makes so that families can return to work. I think we've made great progress there. We've got more work to do. You've probably heard of waitlists and freezes happening with our child care assistance program for families who are, lower income households. We're serving a very small percentage of families through that program right now who actually qualify. And so there are many families who are really trying to, stay in jobs, get into new jobs, right? Lots of reskilling and upskilling happening in our economy. I know the state chamber's been a huge champion of that work. And we want to make sure that if someone gets those skills and they want to find a job and childcare is the one thing they need to make that happen, that they can find it and it's not a barrier to them.
Well, let's talk about a couple of the things that are coming this year. First up, let's discuss House Bill 1004, a proposal to extend the child care contribution tax credit that made it unanimously through its first committee, but now sits somewhat forlornly in the House Appropriations Committee during a year when the state faces an $850 million budget shortfall. Tell me exactly what this credit is for those people who don't know about it, what it would do, and whether you fear that its fiscal note's going to cause it problems this year.
So the child care contribution tax credit here in Colorado is a 50% income tax credit available to organizations and individuals on their Colorado tax return. And so it's a dollar for dollar, 50% tax credit on donations they make to child care organizations. We're talking about organizations like community child care facilities or Head Start programs, Boys and Girls Clubs, Big Brothers Big Sisters, right? Lots of amazing programs around Colorado who provide critically important care and services for our youth and for our children. Those donors can contribute to those organizations and receive a 50% tax credit back. It generates about $70 million in donations every year here in Colorado, right? So it's very much a public-private partnership model where the state is putting a little bit in, right? And of course, offering that tax credit. And you've got individuals and organizations then putting a lot more in as well and contributing to childcare in our state. It's been around for over 2 decades. It's a really important tax credit, heavily utilized by over 20,000 donors and over 6,000 childcare organizations around the state. So epic because we have been, of course, advocating for this investment in the childcare sector over the years as a group of business leaders. We want to make sure that this tax credit stays in place. It is up for reauthorization. And so this bill is aiming to reauthorize this tax credit for an additional 10 years. And super thrilled to say that we have leadership, minority and majority leadership from both the House and the Senate on this bill. Clear message to our legislature and our, General Assembly that childcare is a priority for Colorado. And even in this really tough budget environment, we need to make sure that we are continuing to incentivize and retain those investments in childcare in our state.
Okay. Well, we'll watch that one. Another one I know is very important, Senate Bill 20, which loosens some regulations around child care centers and is up for its first hearing on February 25th. I won't attempt to describe this one. I'll leave that to you. Tell me about what this bill does and why it could be so important to the people who run and are thinking about starting child care centers.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sure you may have heard childcare is a regulated industry. There is a lot of complexity to it. And of course, we want to make sure that children are healthy and safe and well cared for. And at the same time, we recognize these are largely small businesses who are running childcare facilities and businesses. And we want to make sure that the regulations are not too overly burdensome, right? We are taking advantage of technology and streamlining processes when and where we can, understanding that this is usually one business owner who's wearing, the typical 20 hats, trying to do all the things at once. And we don't want it to be so cumbersome or burdensome for them that they either leave the industry or they don't even start a business to begin with. And so this bill is really looking at how we streamline technology systems for licensing, including how the state is looking at those qualifications for teachers who are working with children in classrooms, right? So how do we streamline those systems and use technology for that? How do we think about consistency across all of those licensing representatives who are actually going into childcare facilities to verify that those rules are being met? Thinking about the local government pathway for approval for childcare facilities, it's really complex, right? Local controlled state, we've got, a layer of state regulations, plus you've got those layers of things like zoning and building and fire and health locally. So thinking about how we can hopefully streamline those things and incentivize our local government partners to be good partners in that process and help those childcare businesses get through that process effectively. And then lastly, thinking about a task force to help us really simplify, align, and modernize our childcare regulations, right? And I think that's over time, you tend to see these regulations, new ones are added pretty consistently. Things come up, right? Of course. And at the same time, you have to also prune those back and think about, what has changed in our industry or what has changed through technology, what might be driving significant costs in that childcare business model that may or may not be necessary for the quality and the healthy, safe care of children. And so that task force would really be looking at how we can better, I think, align and modernize and update those regulations to be friendly for those childcare businesses and also still protect healthy, safe care for children.
And so flat out, I think the goal sounds like it's going to make it easier for what? People to expand and to operate, people to open, maybe all of the above?
All of the above. Yeah, I think people looking to open childcare businesses, we want that to be a clear pathway. The people who are operating those businesses right now, we want to provide them with some relief and make sure that it's as easy and simplified as possible. And also just make sure that, again, we are staying up with the times. Technology, AI, right? All these things are evolving around us. Those things can all help bring better efficiency and better coordination and sometimes, better sense to the regulatory process for childcare.
Two other bills, Senate Bill 19, Senate Bill 50. I don't want to dwell on them, just in like a sentence or two. What do each of those do?
Yeah, so Senate Bill 50 is really it's pretty straightforward. The requirement to document and disclose how electronic footage of children and teachers is stored and used. So, oftentimes parents may have a childcare or daycare facility where they have cameras in that facility. They want to make sure parents understand how is that footage being used and shared, right? So a lot of common sense there in terms of what that is. And then Senate Bill 19 is really, again, thinking about systemic alignment. We know it's a tough budget year, right? Everyone's kind of looking at where is the money going? Are there ways for us to be more efficient or effective with how we're spending money in Colorado? This bill, again, is really looking at some of the structures and organizations around the state that have been facilitating childcare supports. We have organizations called resource and referral agencies, local coordinating organizations. They were created when universal preschool passed, and then early childhood councils. And there's actually a lot of crossover and redundancies in those entities, but the statute and the budget is not aligned and streamlined in such a way. So it's really aligning that and I think making better use of our resources.
Good. Last question for you. The only real opposition I'm hearing so far is the question of, is this really the role of government to be this involved in childcare and to be allowing tax credits, things like that? What do you say to people who say, shouldn't government be worried about other things other than childcare?
Well, unfortunately, we have seen the news stories, right? We know that there are certainly compelling reasons to make sure that when young children, especially children who cannot communicate for themselves, right, who are, maybe not as mobile or able to stand up for themselves, are in healthy and safe environments. And certainly, I think there's good reason for, our state partners to be involved in that process to make sure that we've got some standards in place to support healthy and safe care of children when families are at work and are relying and depending on those services. And at the same time, we also want to make sure that we are not impeding those businesses and we're not impeding the ability for people to start new businesses, right? And how do we balance all of that? I think the bigger conversation here oftentimes around public investment comes into play too, right? Where employers are saying, hey, I can't hire the people that I need, or hey, I'm having a really hard time getting people to show up to my campus and show up to work in a specific time and location every day. Childcare is an issue. How do we address this for our workforce? And oh, by the way, how do we address this kind of on a broader scale, right? So this is why EPIC exists. We were created by the business community, by executives and business leaders who said there are compelling economic reasons for us to be involved in this conversation. Let's approach it from a balanced and business-focused way.
Excellent. Nicole Riehl, President and CEO of EPIC, Child Care Advocacy Organization. Thank you for coming on and talking about this issue. We will keep monitoring it all season long here, all session long, to see how things come out.
Thank you so much for your leadership, Ed. We appreciate it.
And now we are sitting down with State Senator Mark Baisley, a Republican from Woodland Park, and he is going to be talking about childcare. Now, I'm going to tell you, this is not going to be our typical pro-con interview about a subject, because Senator Baisley has made it clear that he, too, is all for boosting childcare in Colorado. But unlike those who are backing these bills that we've talked about previously, he's not wild about the state's role in this. And so we want to have a nuanced discussion about other ways to look at the childcare issue with him. Senator Baisley, thank you for coming on to the show today.
Thanks for having me, Ed. It's my pleasure.
Well, let me start with this. What exactly do you believe the state's role should be in helping to alleviate the shortage of childcare facilities that Colorado faces?
You hear that silence? So it's really what I think that the right role is for government beyond defending the people's rights, which is the primary purpose as stated in our founding document, would be to facilitate commerce, to try to create those opportunities for people to make good money for their families, to take good care of their families, themselves and their families. That's the proper role when it comes to childcare, is to just equip parents in the limited manner that the government ought to be equipping them by creating opportunities for them to go make a good living for themselves. After that, we need to defend children from any kind of inappropriate behavior towards them. So that kind of law enforcement measures, that's appropriate role. But to provide child care I just don't see that in any founding document I've ever read. So not only do I not see it as a founding principle, but even the role that the state has adopted through its early childhood program is actually in conflict with the expressed will of the people in the state of Colorado through ballot measure EE a few years ago.
Now, that's interesting. I kind of picked up your roles, your thoughts in this when I heard your no vote specifically on Senate Bill 19, which is the effort to combine early childhood councils and local coordinating organizations. Let me just dig into that real quickly. I mean, why was that problematic for you?
So the bill was to tax tobacco, if you might recall. So this was like 2020 or 2022, somewhere I don't recall exactly what year that it ran, but it was a statewide ballot measure, EE, and it was to tax tobacco in order to fund the program to tell teenagers, hey, don't use tobacco. And then if there was money left over from that, then we could pay down the debt that we owed to K-12. We had that budget shortfall that lasted for a long time. And then if there's money left over after that second funding, then we could launch and fund the early childhood program. Now, do you remember that massive campaign telling teenagers to stay off of tobacco?
I remember a campaign when I was a kid, certainly.
When you were a kid. Do you remember it since 2022 or 2020?
No.
Neither do I. So where was that money spent? Well, not on the number one issue that the people were asked, do you want to fund this? Do you want to tax tobacco in order to prevent the youth from taking on tobacco as a practice? Sure, that makes sense. Let the tobacco industry fund that. Well, they never funded it. At least I don't recall seeing a single ad. But certainly it did not get spent to the level that it was taxed. And we had that budget shortfall for years after Proposition EE went through. And we finally caught that up through other funding, not through the funding that came from tobacco. All that funding went straight to that third option, which was intentionally set as the third option. It says right in that bill, it says, and then if. So this was thwarting the will of the people of Colorado to create their big dream of let's start raising the people's children for them.
Okay. The other bill I want to ask you specifically about, it hasn't gotten to your chamber yet, but House Bill 1004, that's going to be the bill that seeks to extend the child care contribution tax credit. I'm curious your thoughts on something like this. I know you're someone who likes people paying less taxes, but is a tax credit for child care contributions, is that appropriate for the state?
So I always reserve, I haven't read that bill to have a solid opinion on it. So, but generally speaking, yeah, the less taxes, the better. So I would approach this pretty positively, optimistically, saying, hey, if parents can get a break while they have children at home and have a tax credit, then I would likely be for that.
Okay. So I guess I'll bring it back to your first thought about government not having a role in childcare. What is the best thing government can do then? You said, look, we want government to be able to help people be able to afford childcare, to make a living, to afford childcare. Does that involve proactive measures, or are we talking about should the government be looking at maybe rolling back some measures, rolling back regulations that could help people afford childcare better?
Yeah. This nation was built on the laws of nature and of nature's God. It's written in that document up on my wall, the Declaration of Independence and the mission statement for the nation. And that, if you think about that natural law, so the laws of nature and nature's God, we more often refer to that as natural law. It's that amazing transaction where the buyer and the seller agree to some transaction, a purchase. The buyer values that product or service more than the money that they're paying for it. And the seller values the money they're receiving more than the product or service they're providing. They both come out ahead. How cool is that? We bless each other for a living. That's natural law. But when the government inserts itself into that transaction, says, oh, I need to tax you a little bit on that transaction because, after all, I have to provide you with law enforcement and so on. And so to some degree, yeah, we agree to that. We say, yeah, that's the proper role of government to do that. But as that just keeps growing and growing and growing, then the government has stepped way beyond its role, and we stop being able to afford individually things like childcare. So the government's footprint is so large now that then the government says, oh, look at that. You can't afford childcare. I'm going to provide that for you. I just need a little bit more taxes to do that, a little bit more. And it has grown over the 250 years that we've been a nation to where it's at now. It was never a natural position for the government to be involved in providing childcare. That's why I say, hey, if we can just help facilitate commerce in that natural law transaction between people, if they are healthy financially, everything else follows. We don't worry so much about affordable housing because they can afford that house, and so on and so forth, and raising their kids. So, yeah, I want to just philosophically whittle back the size and scope of government to as small as possible, but also look at everything that has gone wrong in our public schools. Most of our social ills seem to be surrounding public schools. The boys and girls locker room, in sports. This is what happens when you start allowing the government to raise your kids, to have control of your kids for several hours a day. They haven't done well with it. It hasn't done well over time. Started out pretty good, hasn't done well over time. So it doesn't make sense to me that we also reach down and surrender children and the raising those children at an even earlier age.
All right. Well, here we have two different looks at childcare. Maybe agreement that childcare is something people should be able to seek out, but not agreement on the government's role in that. Senator Mark Baisley, thank you so much for joining us today on Colorado Chamber Office Hours.
Thank you, Ed.
That's it for our interview segment. Now let's take a quick look at what you need to know about the week ahead. Once again, we are focusing on 5 business-themed bills that you may want to watch this week. At 1:30 p.m. Wednesday, the House Transportation, Housing, and Local Government Committee will hear House Bill 1114, which seeks to ban local governments from requiring a minimum lot size larger than 2,000 square feet for single-family homes. This is yet another effort by Democratic legislators to push for denser housing on the theory that it will allow more housing to be built and, in doing so, will boost housing competition and help to slow escalating home prices. And once again, while some builders and employers may like the sound of this, it's likely to become a fight over local governments rather than the state being able to control how their community grows. The hearing is in Legislative Services Building Hearing Room A. Also at 1:30 p.m. Wednesday, the Senate Transportation and Energy Committee will hear a notable bill that seeks to reduce emissions from the transportation sector via carrots rather than a stick. Senate Bill 21 would permit the Clean Fleet Enterprise to offer grants to trucking companies to replace highly polluting semis built before 2009 with much more efficient but still gas-burning trucks made after 2017 when greater emissions controls were put into place. Bipartisan backers say efforts like these are key to reducing emissions quickly, particularly when there are a very limited number of high-cost, zero-emission commercial trucks available for purchase. But some environmental advocates say this undermines the goal of getting fuel-burning trucks off the road. The debate will play out in Senate Committee Room 252. On Thursday afternoon, the House Business Affairs and Labor Committee will hear House Bill 1043, which is the latest bill that seeks to boost regulations on transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft. This would significantly increase the penalty for those companies that received reports of drivers discriminatorily refusing to pick up riders, and it would require those companies to provide publicly available monthly reports about all of those instances. The TNCs and business organizations like the Colorado Chamber are seeking some amendments to ensure these rules are technically and economically feasible, which is a concern that Governor Polis has expressed for similar bills in the past. It's scheduled to go third on the 1:30 p.m. agenda in House Committee Room 112. Also Thursday afternoon, the Senate Local Government and Housing Committee will hear Senate Bill 24, which authorizes the use of unmanned aircraft, yes, we're talking about drones here, and bars local governments from regulating anything other than their places of launch and landing so as to not create a patchwork of rules across the state. Stop me if you've heard this one before, but this is going to come down to a battle over local control. The bill is second on the 1:30 p.m. agenda in Senate Committee Room 357. Finally, also on Thursday afternoon, the Senate Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee will hear Senate Bill 62, which seeks to restrict the use of rodenticide. Now, you may think that rodenticide is the name of that band that once opened for Megadeth, but it's actually a poison or poisoned glue trap designed to kill rodents that is used by both commercial pest control services and individuals. SB 62 would ban the use of those products unless they're used in response to a public emergency, as proponents say they pose an unacceptable risk to public health, particularly for children under 5 years of age. Business groups like the Colorado Chamber and a bevy of agricultural groups oppose the measure, saying it goes too far in regulating a product that already serves the public health by limiting rat infestations. It's fifth on the 1:30 p.m. agenda in Senate Committee Room 352. That's all for this episode of Colorado Chamber Office Hours. Once again, I'm Ed Sealover, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Colorado Chamber of Commerce and editor of the Sum and Substance. I'll keep the conversation going at tsscolorado.com, and we'll see you next time as we explore the issues that matter most to business.